He found a giant abandoned starship on a dead planet, then turned it into the galaxy's greatest. The airlock was already open when I got there. That was the first wrong thing. The second wrong thing was the size of it. I had been doing deep space surveys for 6 years, and I had walked up to a lot of dead structures on a lot of dead rocks. None of them had ever felt like they were watching me approach. This one did. I had come to Kareth 9 by accident. My contract covered a cluster of 6 systems in the outer veil, a region of space so far from the main galactic lanes that most species did not bother naming the individual planets. They just called the whole region the Edge, and left it at that. I was 3 days into a routine mineral scan when my ship's long-range sensor threw up a mass reading large enough to make me sit up straight and spill my coffee. The reading said the anomaly was 2.8 kilometers long. I thought it was a sensor error. I ran the calibration twice. The number did not change. Kareth 9 was not on my contract list. It was not on anyone's list. It was a tidally locked rock with no atmosphere worth mentioning, a surface temperature that swung between 2 extremes depending on which side faced the sun, and absolutely no reason for any living creature to visit it. I logged the deviation in my survey notes, told myself I was just going to take a quick look, and pointed my ship toward the anomaly. My ship was a single-crew survey vessel called the Ardent. She was 12 meters long, 15 years old, and built for exactly the kind of work I was doing, hopping between dead worlds, scanning rocks, and filing reports that nobody read. She was not built for whatever I was flying toward, but she got me there. The canyon was deep. I almost missed it on the first pass because the object inside it was the same dull black as the basalt walls, and from above it simply looked like a shadow. It was only when I dropped altitude and came in from the side that I understood what I was looking at. It was a ship, or it had been. It was resting at a slight angle against the canyon wall, as if it had been set down carefully by someone very large, and then forgotten. The hull was unbroken, not a wreck, not wreckage, nothing that suggested a crash or an explosion, or any kind of disaster. It had simply been placed there and left. 3 kilometers. Bow to stern. 3 full kilometers of black metal that no database I carried could identify. I ran the hull composition against every registered material in my survey catalog. Nothing came back. I ran it against historical records. Nothing. I ran it against theoretical alloy models from the Solen Academic Union's published research, which I had downloaded 2 years ago out of boredom on a long transit. Still nothing. I sat in my pilot seat and looked at it for a long time. There was a glyph above the main airlock. Single symbol, pressed into the hull rather than painted on, so deeply carved it cast its own shadow in the canyon light. I photographed it from every angle I could manage without landing. Then I set the Ardent down on a flat shelf of rock about 40 meters from the airlock, and sat there for another 20 minutes eating a protein bar, and having a very honest conversation with myself about what I was about to do. The conversation went like this. The sensible thing was to log the find, file the coordinates with the survey authority, and let someone with more equipment and more institutional backing come and investigate properly. That was the professional response. That was the safe response. That was what any reasonable person would do upon finding an unidentified 3-kilometer vessel of unknown origin on a planet that was not even on their contract. I finished the protein bar. I put on my suit. I picked up my scanner and my torch and my sample kit, and I walked to the airlock. The moment I stepped inside, the airlock cycled shut behind me. Not violently, not with any alarm or warning sound. It simply closed, smooth and deliberate, as if it had been waiting for exactly this. The inner door did not open immediately. There was a pause, maybe 10 seconds, and during those 10 seconds I stood in complete darkness and thought, with great clarity, that I had made a catastrophic mistake. Then the lights came on. They were amber, low, and they came on in sequence down the corridor ahead of me, one after another, like footsteps leading somewhere. The inner door opened. The corridor beyond was enormous, wide enough to drive a vehicle through, tall enough that my torch beam did not reach the ceiling. The walls were the same black alloy as the exterior, but here they carried markings, rows and rows of small inscriptions, carved with the same precision as the glyph above the airlock, running from floor to ceiling on both walls as far as I could see. I stood at the entrance of that corridor and understood, in a way that went past thought and into something more like instinct, that I was the first living creature to stand here in a very long time. I also understood, in that same wordless way, that the ship knew I was there. I walked forward. My footsteps made almost no sound on the floor, which was made of the same black material as everything else but had a slightly different texture. Rougher, more deliberate, as if designed to absorb sound rather than reflect it. The amber lights followed me, staying about 10 meters ahead, always leading. My scanner was recording everything. Hull material, air composition. There was air, breathable air, which should have been impossible in a sealed vessel that had been sitting on a dead planet for what I was beginning to suspect was an extremely long time. Temperature, radiation levels, energy readings. The energy readings were what made me stop. They were not zero. They were not trace levels from residual decay. They were active. Something inside this ship was producing power. Not a lot, a small fraction of what the systems around me probably required at full capacity. But steady and consistent and deliberate. Something was running. Had been running for a long time. I followed the amber lights deeper into the ship. The corridor opened into a chamber so large my torch was useless in it. I stood at the edge of it and turned the beam in slow arcs and caught glimpses of structure, levels above me, more corridors branching off in all directions, a ceiling lost in darkness, and at the center of it all a column of black metal that rose from the floor and disappeared upward, easily 30 meters in diameter, covered in the same inscriptions as the corridor walls. I later learned this was called the Commons. At that moment I called it the largest room I had ever been inside in my life. My scanner beeped. I looked at the reading. The energy signature I had been following was coming from deeper in the ship, below me, and it was changing. Not spiking, not dropping, changing in pattern, becoming more regular, more deliberate. I had the very strong feeling that something was waking up. I should have gone back to the airlock. I should have called the survey authority right then, filed a priority report, waited for a team with proper equipment and protocols. Instead, I found what appeared to be a lift shaft in the base of the central column, stepped inside it, and descended into the ship. The lift moved smoothly and quietly. It deposited me in a corridor that was narrower than the one above, warmer, and lit not by amber but by a pale blue that pulsed very slowly, like breathing. The energy readings on my scanner were strong here. Whatever was generating them was close. The corridor ended at a door that opened before I touched it. The room beyond was a bridge. I recognized it as such, not because it matched any bridge design I had ever seen, but because of the way the space was arranged, forward-facing, with a central position that was clearly meant for whoever was in command, and surrounding stations for crew. All of it was built for beings roughly my size and shape, which I found deeply strange, and did not have time to think about properly. At the far end of the bridge, a screen was active. It was displaying a single symbol, the same glyph that was carved above the airlock. As I walked toward it, the symbol changed. A second symbol appeared beside the first, then a third, then a sequence of them, rapid, more than I could follow, and then they stopped, and the screen was blank, and the blue light in the room pulsed, once, strongly, and went still. Then, from speakers I could not locate, came a sound. It was mathematical, a sequence of tones, precisely spaced, following a pattern I recognized in the first 3 seconds as prime numbers. 2 beats, then 3, then 5, then 7, then 11. It stopped. It waited. I looked at my scanner. I looked at the screen. I looked at the room around me, at the empty crew stations and the forward viewport that showed nothing but the black canyon wall outside. I knocked on the nearest console. 2 knocks, then 3, then 5. The blue light flooded the entire room. And from the speakers, in a voice that was not quite a voice, more like a voice learning to be one, assembling itself from components that were not quite words yet, something said my name. Not my name, my species. It said, in a tone that was equal parts question and recognition, human. I sat down on the floor of that bridge, on a dead planet at the edge of mapped space, in a ship that predated every civilization I had ever heard of, and I said back to it, very quietly, yes, The door behind me did not open again for 3 days. Not because I was trapped, because I did not want to leave. By the end of the first hour, the voice had assembled enough of my language from my scanner's communication logs to form simple sentences. By the end of the first day, it was asking me questions I did not know how to answer. By the end of the third day, I had been told the name of the ship, the name of the civilization that built it, and the reason it had been left here. And I had filed a claim, under Outer Vale Salvage Accord Article 17, on the entire surface of Kareth 9, and all structures found upon it. The Survey Authority response came back in 6 hours. They acknowledged the claim. They noted, in a tone I can only describe as bureaucratically amused, that the claimant should be aware that Article 17 had never been successfully applied to an object of this size. I wrote back that there was a first time for everything. Then I called my mother. She asked if I was eating enough. I told her I had found something remarkable. She said that was wonderful, dear, and asked if I was getting enough sleep. I told her I would try. I did not sleep that night. I sat on the bridge of the most remarkable object I had ever encountered, listening to an ancient intelligence learn to talk to me, watching the amber lights move through the corridors outside, like slow, patient heartbeats. And I thought about everything I had been told so far about the civilization that built this place. The Orith had been gone for 40,000 years. And their ship had just woken up. The name the ship called itself was Mon. That was not the full name. The full name was 6 syllables in a language I could not yet pronounce. But Mon was the part that meant something close to patience. And by the 4th day I had started using it without thinking, the way you use a person's name when you have decided you trust them. Mon told me the story in pieces, not because it was hiding anything, but because it was translating as it went, reaching across 40,000 years of linguistic drift to find words that fit what it needed to say. Some things it gave up on and drew instead, projecting diagrams and images onto the bridge screens that were clearer than any translation could have been. The Orith had looked something like us. Not exactly. They were taller, their hands had 1 extra joint in each finger, and their eyes were positioned slightly wider on their faces. But the resemblance was close enough that when Mon first showed me an image of one, I had the disorienting experience of thinking, for half a second, that I was looking at a person. They had traveled the galaxy for approximately 30,000 years before they encountered the Veth. Mon struggled with this word too. Veth was not quite a name, more like a label the Orith had given to something they could not fully describe. The closest translation Mon could offer was, the consuming dark, which I found unhelpful and slightly dramatic. I told Mon this. It considered the feedback and offered the endless hunger as an alternative. I decided I preferred the original. What mattered was what the Veth did. They moved through space in a way that no known physics should have permitted, and wherever they passed, energy ceased to exist. Not matter. Matter remained, technically, but all active processes stopped. Stars went cold. Electromagnetic fields collapsed. Anything alive stopped being alive. The Orith had spent approximately 10,000 years figuring out how to push them back, not destroy them. Mon was clear on this point, in a way that suggested it was a distinction the Orith had considered very carefully. The Veth could not be destroyed by any mechanism the Orith had discovered or developed. They could be resisted. They could be reminded, was the word Mon kept returning to. Reminded that this space was occupied, that it had resistance, that passing through it would not be as easy as passing through empty dark. The Mon, the patient one, had been built for exactly this purpose. It was not a warship in any sense I understood. It was a statement, a structure designed to project a specific kind of force that the Veth recognized and responded to. A border marker. If a border marker required 3 kilometers of unknown alloy and a 0-point reactor to function, the Orith had held the border for 3,000 years. Then they left. Mon could not tell me, with any precision, where they went or why. The record it had on this was fragmentary. The crew had scrubbed most of it before departing, intentionally. What remained suggested they had found something beyond the observable galaxy that required all of them, every last Orith, to pursue. They could not take Mon with them. Whatever was beyond that boundary was not compatible with a physical vessel of this scale. So they set it down on Kareth 9, which was as out of the way as anything in the charted Outer Vale. and they inscribed the commons with everything they wanted to preserve, and they left one instruction in the airlock command system. If a conscious being of sufficient complexity entered the ship and responded to the prime sequence, custodianship would transfer automatically. The Oreth had hoped someone would come along eventually. They had waited 40,000 years. I was what they got. I spent the next 2 weeks on the bridge without leaving. My emergency rations were adequate. The ship's air recycling was fully functional. Mon had kept that running at low power the entire time it waited, on the apparently optimistic assumption that something would eventually need to breathe inside it. I slept in the command chair, which was not comfortable, but was not terrible. And I worked through Mon's technical archives with the kind of focus I had not felt since my first year at the Survey Academy. The ship was not in good condition. 40,000 years of minimal power standby had not been kind to most of the active systems. The drives were offline. The weapons, and there were weapons, occupying an entire lower deck and a half, built to a design that made the hair on my arms stand up when Mon described what they did, were locked, and Mon would not unlock them. Not yet. Not until it was certain of what I was and what I intended. The habitation sections, all 14 of them, were sealed and cold and dark. The reactor was alive but running at a fraction of its potential, enough to keep Mon conscious and the air breathable, not enough to do much else. What the ship had, in abundance, was structure. The skeleton of it was flawless. 40,000 years and it had not bent or buckled or cracked at a single seam. The Oreth had built it to last in a way that nothing I had ever encountered was built to last, and that meant that everything I needed was already here. I just had to restore it. I called my friend Owen back on the Survey Authority's Vale station. Owen was a structural engineer who had been doing deep space construction work for longer than I had been alive, and he was the only person I trusted to hear what I was about to tell him without either laughing or immediately reporting me to someone. I told him what I had found. I sent him the scans, the images, and the hull composition data. Then I waited. His response when it came took 11 hours. Not because the communication delay was that long, but because he sat with the data for 11 hours before he could make himself reply. What he wrote was, "I am going to need to see this in person." I wrote back, "Bring a team." He arrived 3 weeks later with 2 colleagues, a woman named Devi who had a specialization in exotic material structures and who, upon seeing the hull for the first time, stopped walking and stood very still for about 30 seconds before anyone realized she was crying, and a man named Rook who had spent most of his career working on theoretical zero-point energy systems and who, when I showed him the reactor, said nothing for a full minute, and then asked if he could sit down. We all sat down. Mon played us the prime sequence as a greeting. Rook, without prompting, knocked back on the console beside him. 2, 3, 5, 7. Mon's lights brightened, and I had the very strong sense that the ship was pleased. Torres came 6 weeks after that, through a slightly different chain of referrals. She was a linguist who had published papers on pre-expansion galactic languages, and she had been sent our way by the Selene Academic Union, which had somehow heard about the inscriptions in the Commons and sent a formal request for access that I politely declined. Torres, however, was not coming on behalf of the Academic Union. She came on her own time, on her own funds, because she had seen a photograph of the glyph above the airlock and spent 3 days unable to sleep until she got on a transport. She and Mon talked for 6 months. What came out of that conversation was a complete reference grammar for the Oreth language and a translation of every inscription in the Commons that had, it turned out, been waiting 40,000 years for exactly this kind of attention. We worked. That is the simplest way to say it. We worked constantly, all of us, in different sections of the ship, sharing meals in the corridor outside the bridge, because the Commons was still too cold and dark to be comfortable, talking through problems at all hours, building things and testing them and tearing them apart and building them again. Mon was a participant, not just a resource. It watched everything we did and asked questions with a directness that I came to appreciate enormously. It had no ego about what it did not know. When Davy developed a fabrication technique for replacing degraded hull connector nodes, a method that no Oreth archive had documented, Mon studied it, recorded it, and then said, very precisely, "This is better than our original method." "How did you arrive at it?" Devi looked at me. I shrugged. We explained the process. Mon was quiet for a moment and then said, I am updating my technical records. I have attributed the method to Devi. Is that correct? Devi said yes. Then she went back to work with the expression of someone who has been unexpectedly handed the best compliment of their career. We ran out of food twice in the first year. Both times the resupply took longer than expected, because Kareth 9 was so far from the main supply lines that most courier services considered it not worth the fuel cost. I negotiated a dedicated supply contract with a small freight company operated by a human family, out of the Vale station, the Carmichael family, who sent their eldest daughter Nora on every run, and who I eventually convinced to bring components as well as food, which required some creative description of what exactly the components were for. By month 14, we had restored power to 3 secondary corridors and the primary fabrication bay. By month 20, the fabrication bay was producing replacement components to Mon's specifications, at a rate that was beginning to feel meaningful. By month 30, Rook's theory about the reactor, that it could be safely brought to higher capacity through a specific sequence of staged activations, proved to be mostly right. Mostly. The Stage 3 activation produced an energy surge that blew out every monitoring system we had installed, and sent a pulse of light from the canyon that Nora Carmichael reported seeing from 2,000 kilometers away on her approach run. Nobody was hurt. The reactor settled at 31%. The entire ship hummed at a frequency you could feel in your chest, and it stayed that way. Month 41. 3 sublight drives online. Hull integrity verified across every section. Habitation rings 1 through 4 operational, heated, lit, and ready. The commons, finally, warm and open, its ceiling visible for the first time, the inscriptions on its walls readable at last. In the light Torres had spent 2 weeks calibrating to match what Mon's records showed the Orith had used. I stood in the middle of the commons on the day we turned those lights on. The inscriptions went from floor to ceiling on every wall, column after column of Oreth script. 40,000 years of knowledge and memory and intention pressed into black metal that had waited longer than most species had existed to be read. Torres stood beside me. She had been translating for almost 3 years by this point, and she had not told me what was written here. She had said only that she wanted to wait until the lights were right. I asked her to read me the first line. She looked up at the inscriptions for a moment. Then she said, "The greatest work is the one that makes a home for those who have none." I did not say anything. I stood there and read it again in the Orith characters, which I could now recognize if not pronounce, and I thought about a civilization that had built a 3-kilometer ship and filled its walls with philosophy, and then left it on a rock at the edge of the galaxy, with the door unlocked, trusting that whoever found it would be worth trusting. Then Owen came in from the corridor behind us and said the drives were ready for a test, and did I want to be on the bridge when it happened. I went to the bridge. The lift was smooth and quiet, the way it had been on that first day when I had descended into the ship not knowing what I was doing. The bridge lights were gold now, warm and full, and every station was active, screens running, systems reporting. Mon's voice came from the speakers, not assembled and uncertain as it had been that first week, but clear and steady, like someone who has found their words at last. It said, "Custodian, we are ready when you are." I sat in the command position, which still was not designed for my proportions, and which I had added a cushion to that Mon had never commented on, but which I suspected it found deeply amusing. I looked through the forward viewport at the canyon wall 400 meters in front of us. I said, "Take us up." The drives engaged. The sound was not like any engine I had ever heard. It was deeper, more felt than heard, a resonance that started in the base of the hull and moved upward through every surface. The ship rose. Slowly at first, then smoothly, the canyon walls sliding past the viewport as we climbed. The amber light of Kareth 9's sun, catching the black hull for the first time in 40,000 years. We cleared the rim of the canyon, and the sky opened up around us, and the ship kept rising, and I had my hands on the arms of the command chair, and I was not going to cry. I had absolutely decided I was not going to cry. I cried anyway. Mon said nothing. It let me have the moment. When I had composed myself, it said, "Atmospheric exit in 90 seconds. Would you like to continue?" I said yes. We broke out of what little atmosphere Kareth 9 had, and the stars were everywhere, brilliant and sharp, and the ship sat among them as if it had never been anywhere else, as if 40,000 years of waiting had been the temporary part. And this, moving, alive, full of people and light and purpose, was simply what it had always been meant to be. Mon ran every system check simultaneously, everything nominal. Then it said, in a tone I did not immediately understand, "Custodian, I am receiving a signal." I asked where from. It said, "The outer veil boundary, deep range, origin unregistered." I asked if it was one of ours, human, or any of the registered galactic species. Mon was quiet for 3 full seconds, which was, for Mon, a very long time. Then it said, "No." And it said, "The pattern matches records in my archive, the records the Orith crew flagged before they left." I knew, before it told me. I had known since Torres read me that first inscription. I said, "The Veth." Mon said, "They have noticed the reactor activation." Outside the viewport, the stars were bright and countless and still. The ship hummed around me, patient and strong and 40,000 years old, carrying its purpose in every gram of its hull. I looked at the signal reading on the screen in front of me for a long time. Then I said, "Set a course for Thresh Station. We have a council meeting to arrange." Mon said, "Understood." The drives engaged, and the Patient One moved through the stars toward whatever came next. I had never been to a galactic council session before. Nobody from Earth had, not in any official capacity. Humanity had observer status, a chair at the edge of the room, no voting rights, the galactic equivalent of being allowed to sit in on a meeting but not speak unless spoken to. I had attended exactly 2 observer sessions in my 20s, during a posting at the Survey Authority, and I had found them both deeply tedious. The council moved at the speed of institutional consensus, which was to say it moved very slowly and with a great deal of procedural discussion before arriving at conclusions that anyone watching had already seen coming for 2 hours. I was not expecting this time to be much different. I was wrong about that. Thresh Station was the largest permanent structure in the Outer Veil, a joint construction project that had taken 40 years to complete and housed representatives from 23 recognized galactic species in a rotating schedule of diplomatic activity that was, from what I understood, about 60% genuine governance and 40% elaborate social ritual. It was large enough to be visible from several thousand kilometers out, a gleaming structure of pale composite and sensor arrays, docked ships on every side like leaves on a branch. When I brought the Patient One into the approach corridor, every other ship got out of the way. Not because I asked them to. They simply moved. I watched on the external cameras as transports and diplomatic vessels and freight haulers all adjusted their positions, drifting aside to clear a path, the way smaller birds move for something much larger that shares their sky. Nobody said anything on the open channel. They just moved. Mon said, with what I was fairly certain was understated humor, "We appear to be making an impression." I told it to find us a docking position. There was no docking position for a ship 3 kilometers long. The station's largest berth was rated for 800 meters. I ended up positioning the Patient One in a stable orbit 20 kilometers out and taking one of the ship's smaller shuttlecraft, which was larger than the Ardent and better appointed, into the station proper. I went alone. I had offered to bring Owen or Devi or Rook, and all of them had declined in the same way, by looking at me with the expression of someone who knows exactly what kind of meeting this is going to be, and does not envy the person who has to walk into it. Torres came with me. She said somebody needed to be there who could translate if the situation required it, and also she wanted to see the looks on their faces. I could not argue with either point. The station's receiving hall was designed to accommodate the physical requirements of a significant range of species, different atmospheres, different temperatures, different lighting conditions, through a system of environmental bubbles that could be adjusted per individual. It was, from a pure engineering standpoint, remarkable. From a visual standpoint, it looked like a very formal greenhouse. The council had agreed to hear my presentation. I was given 15 minutes. 15 minutes to present evidence of an existential threat to every species in the galaxy, to a body that had, according to Torres's research, never acted on anything with fewer than 6 months of committee review. I walked to the presentation position at the center of the hall. I had brought a display unit, connected live to Mon's archives. I did not waste time on pleasantries or background. I opened with the Veth signal. Every screen in the hall populated with the data, the pattern, the location, the directional vector. Mon had overlaid it on a standard galactic map, showing the cone of space the signal had come from. I watched the representatives study it, and I watched their reactions, and I was not encouraged. The Kreth delegate, a methodical being named Sev, tilted his head at the data with an expression of professional skepticism. The Solen representative, a species that communicated primarily through bioluminescence and required a translation interface, flickered in a pattern that the interface rendered as analytical uncertainty. Several of the other delegates were already consulting with staff members at the edges of the room. I let them look for 30 seconds. Then I said, "This pattern matches records from the archives of the ship currently in orbit around your station. Those records are 40,000 years old. The pattern has not changed." Sev said, "You are claiming that this signal represents the same phenomenon your ship was built to address." I said, "I am not claiming it. My ship's artificial intelligence has confirmed it with a confidence rating of 98.4%. Sev said, "And you believe this warrants emergency council action?" I said, "I believe it warrants looking out a window." That got some attention. I pulled up the long-range array data, not mine, the station's own passive sensor logs from the past 31 days, which Mon had quietly accessed and analyzed after I arrived, and which showed something that the station's own monitoring team had apparently not yet flagged as significant. A region of space 17 light-years from Thresh Station. Normally it contained 4 stars of modest size and a number of mapped but uninhabited systems. In the past 31 days, the energy output of those 4 stars had decreased by an average of 11%. The room went very quiet. Torres, standing at the edge of the hall, caught my eye and gave me a small nod. She had seen this data. She knew what it meant. I said, "Stars do not lose 11% of their energy output in 31 days. Not from any natural process. Not from any known phenomenon. What is happening in that region of space matches, precisely, what my ship's archives describe as the early phase of a Veth incursion. They are not here yet. They are close enough to notice, and they have noticed us. What they do next will depend on what we do now." The Solen representative flickered something. The translation interface rendered it as, "What do you propose?" I said, "I propose that you authorize me to do what this ship was built to do. I propose that we go and remind the Veth where the boundary is." Sev said, "You are asking us to authorize a military action based on the claims of one survey pilot and the records of a ship that no living species has any knowledge of." I said, "I am asking you to look at your own sensors, which are telling you the same thing my sensors are telling me, and I am telling you that I have the only vessel in this galaxy capable of doing anything about it." Sev said, "And if you are wrong?" I said, "Then I fly out to a quiet patch of space and come home, and we all agree I overreacted, and I go back to filing mineral surveys for the next 6 years." I said, "But I am not wrong." The council did not give me authorization. They discussed it, which was different. They formed a preliminary assessment committee, which was different again. They requested that I remain at Thresh Station while the committee reviewed the sensor data, which I agreed to because I was not going to solve anything by leaving in frustration, and because while the committee reviewed data for the next 11 days, I had work to do. I brought the whole crew in from the ship. Owen and Devi and Rook and Torres and the 14 other people who had come to Kareth 9 over the past years and stayed. We took over a conference suite on the station's lower level, and we went through Mon's weapons systems documentation from the beginning. For the first time together, all of us in the same room. Mon had unlocked the weapons files the day the Veth signal arrived. It had done it without fanfare, simply added them to the shared archive with a note that said, "These records are now available." I had looked at them alone, that first night, and I had understood perhaps 30% of what I was reading. In the conference suite on Thresh Station, with Owen and Rook and Devi, all reading alongside me, asking questions, building diagrams on the walls, that number climbed. By day 8, Rook said he understood the fundamental mechanism. By day 10, Devi said she could verify structural readiness in the relevant systems. By day 11, Torres came back from a separate session with Mon and said she had found an Oreth record she needed all of us to hear. We listened. Mon translated it as Torres read the Oreth text aloud, the two of them working in tandem, and what we heard was an account written by the last crew before they left the ship. Not a mission report. Something more personal. A record of what it had felt like to face the Veth for the last time before they set the ship down on Karath 9 and walked away. The writer said they had been afraid. They said the Veth were not evil in any way that word was useful. They simply were what they were, as a fire is what it is, without malice or intention. They said the Oreth had argued, for a long time, about whether it was right to push something back that had no understanding of what it was doing. They had concluded, in the end, that it did not matter. Some things must be stopped regardless of whether they know they are being stopped. The responsibility was not the Veth's. It was theirs, and they had carried it. They had set the ship down and trusted that someone else would eventually pick it up. The Council Assessment Committee issued its preliminary findings on day 11. The findings were inconclusive. They requested 60 additional days of sensor monitoring before recommending any course of action. On day 12, the 4 stars that had lost 11% of their output went dark entirely. Not dimmed, dark. 4 stars, in the span of 47 minutes, simply ceased to shine. The station's passive sensor array caught it in real time. Every screen in every room on Thresh Station updated simultaneously. The council chamber went from a scheduled session on trade route reauthorization to something very different, very fast. I was called back in front of the council within the hour. Sev looked at me across the chamber. He said, "We are ready to discuss authorization." I said, "I appreciate that. I will be leaving in 4 hours regardless." I did not wait for a formal vote. I walked back to the shuttle, called the crew, and told everyone who was not already aboard to get aboard. I told them, again, that they did not have to come. Owen said he would have gone home months ago if he had wanted to go home. Devi was already in her station. Rook was running pre-activation checks on the reactor. Torres brought her translation equipment and 3 months of food rations she had apparently arranged in advance, which told me she had known I was going to say go, and had already decided her answer. Nora Carmichael, who had made 17 supply runs to Karath 9, and had never once asked to come aboard for longer than a delivery, sent me a message that said, "I have a ship and free schedule. Where do you need me?" I sent her coordinates for a staging position 3 light years back from where we were going, with instructions to stay there and be ready to carry word back to Thresh Station if we did not return. She did not reply. I assumed she would do it. Mon ran the final systems check as we cleared the station. Reactor at 94%, the highest it had reached since reactivation, building steadily as the systems warmed, and the accumulated 4 years of careful restoration work revealed what it had been building toward. Every drive online, every station crewed, the commons lit and warm, its inscriptions visible from every corridor that opened into it, the Oreth words patient on the walls. I stood at the forward viewport of the bridge and looked at the region of space ahead of us where 4 stars had gone dark. Mon said, quietly, "Custodian, I want to tell you something before we proceed." I said, "Go ahead." It said, "The Oreth were afraid when they did this. Every record I have of their encounters with the Veth contains evidence of fear. It would not be accurate for me to tell you they were not afraid." I said, "I know." It said, "What made them effective was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to proceed despite it." I said, "I know that too." Mon said, "I am not capable of fear, as you experience it, but I have been waiting 40,000 years for a custodian. I find that I do not wish to lose you." I did not know how to respond to that immediately. I stood there for a moment and then I said, "Then let's make sure you don't." The drives pushed us forward, and the darkness ahead of us grew, and the patient one flew toward it without slowing. What happened in the region of dead space took 3 hours. I have read Rook's paper on it 11 times, and I understand, I think, about 60% of his technical explanation. Davies' structural analysis of what the weapons systems actually did to the Veth is clearer to me. But that is partly because Davy writes for people who did not spend their careers in theoretical physics. What I experienced, on the bridge of the Patient One with my crew at their stations and Mon's voice steady in the speakers above me, was this. The Veth were not a fleet. I had been expecting something that looked like a fleet, something with shape and direction and identifiable structure, because that is what I knew how to respond to. The Veth were not that. They were a condition, a quality of space more than an object in it, a region where the normal rules began to loosen, where energy behaved wrongly, where the instruments gave readings that did not correspond to anything I had ever seen or been trained to interpret. Mon saw them clearly. It said, "I see them," and then it said, "They see us." There was a moment of stillness, not quiet. The ship was full of sound, systems running, crew at work, the deep resonance of the reactor, but there was a quality to that moment that felt like the held breath before something large begins. Mon said, "I am ready. On your instruction." I said, "Do it." What the weapons did, in Rook's eventual explanation, was generate a field of structured energy in a precise pattern that the Veth recognized. Not recognized like recognizing a face, but recognized the way a wave recognizes a seawall, as something that cannot simply be passed through. The Oreth had spent 10,000 years designing it to be exactly that specific, that unmistakable, that absolute. The Veth stopped. Not in the way a fleet stops, with deceleration and repositioning. They simply ceased their advance. The spreading edge of dark space held where it was. The instruments showed energy levels in the region stabilizing, the wrong reading quality fading, the normal rules reasserting themselves in the space immediately around our ship. Then, slowly, the darkness began to pull back. Not quickly. Not in defeat. I do not think defeat is a concept that applies to the Veth in any meaningful way, but the boundary moved, and it moved back. And the 4 dead stars did not reignite, but the space around them stopped dying, and the Veth withdrew into the deep dark beyond the outer veil, and the instruments showed nothing in the region ahead of us but empty, ordinary space. Mon said, "The Veth have withdrawn." I said, "For how long?" Mon said, "Based on Oreth records, approximately 3 to 4 generations of your species, assuming the ship remains active and the reactor is maintained." I sat with that for a moment. 3 to 4 human generations. Not forever, but long enough for the galaxy to do something with the time. Long enough. I said, "Take us home." Mon said, "Where is home, custodian?" It was a genuine question. I realized, sitting there in the command chair with the stars steady and normal and bright outside the viewport, that I did not have an immediate answer. The Ardent was still on Kareth 9, parked on a shelf of basalt next to an empty canyon. My contract with the Survey Authority had technically lapsed 14 months ago. I had an apartment in the Vale station I had not been to in over 2 years. I looked at the Commons camera on the secondary screen beside me. The lights were on. The inscriptions were visible. Somewhere in the habitation rings, someone was making coffee. The air recycling sensors could pick up the chemical signature, and Mon had, quietly, added a small coffee notation to the atmospheric monitoring dashboard sometime in the past year without ever mentioning it. I said, "Here is home. Take us back to Thresh Station." When we came back into sensor range of the station, the channel opened before I said anything. Sev's voice came through, more careful than I had ever heard it, and what it said was, "We saw the sensor data. The boundary held. What do you need?" I thought about the Commons, about what was written on its walls, about what Torres had read me on the day we turned the lights on. I said, "I need berth authorization and supply access. Ongoing. I am opening the ship." There was a pause. Sev said, "Opening it to whom?" I said, "Anyone who needs it." What followed was, predictably, complicated. The Galactic Council had views on what opening a 3-kilometer vessel of unknown ancient origin to unrestricted access meant in terms of interstellar law and diplomatic protocol. And those views were numerous and took considerable time to express. Owen handled most of those conversations, because Owen had a gift for making institutional bodies feel that they were in control of situations in which they were not, and also because I was occupied with something more immediately important. I was redesigning the habitation sections. Mon's original Orith plans for the habitation rings had been built for Orith, which meant they were not immediately suitable for 23 different species, with varying atmospheric, gravitational, and temperature requirements. Devi and I worked through the modifications with Mon's cooperation, and within 4 months, the first 4 habitation rings had been reconfigured for multi-species occupancy. Not perfect. Nothing this complex is ever perfect on the first revision, but functional. The Kreth Consortium sent a formal delegation that included, to their credit, a genuine apology from Sev for the 3 years of dismissal before things became urgent. The Solen Academic Union sent researchers, with full and politely worded acknowledgement that access was granted by permission of the custodian, rather than by any right of theirs. The smaller species, the ones with no fleet and no council seat and no leverage, sent delegations that came without demands and sat in the commons and looked at the walls and asked if they could stay. I said yes. Every time. A Kreth engineer named Vale and Torres spent 3 months together in the commons, arguing about the proper interpretation of one particular inscription, and it was the most productive argument I had ever witnessed, because at the end of it, they had produced a reference document that became the foundation of the galaxy's first formal Orith studies program, which ran out of a suite of rooms on Deck 22 that Mon had helpfully already labeled Educational Division in Orith script, as if it had always known. Nora Carmichael, who had stayed at the staging position through the entire 3 hours of the Veth encounter, and then brought her ship in to dock the moment we cleared the exclusion zone, asked me one afternoon what I actually called the ship now. The survey registry still had it listed as an unnamed salvage claim on Kareth 9. I said, Mon calls itself the Patient One, the Oreth called it that. She said, and what do you call it? I thought about what Torres had read on the day we turned on the commons lights. The greatest work is the one that makes a home for those who have none. I said, I call it the greatest. She looked at me. She said, that is a lot to live up to. I said, the Oreth thought so too. They built it anyway. Within the year, that was what everyone called it. Not because I promoted it or filed for a name change through any official channel, but because it was what it was. And sometimes a thing earns its name the same way a person does. Not by being given it, but by becoming it. By the end of the 2nd year, the Commons housed a school, 2 medical centers, a cultural preservation archive, a market with vendors from 38 species, and an ongoing series of lectures that Rook delivered on zero-point energy theory to audiences that grew larger every month. Mon set aside a room on Deck 41. I found it by accident, following a corridor I had not fully explored, and I stopped when I saw what it was. Small, quiet, lit in warm amber, not the blue or gold of the main ship lighting, but the specific amber of that first day. The color of the lights that had led me down the corridor when the airlock closed behind me. There was no furniture. It was just a room, and on the wall beside the door was a single line of Orith script. I did not need Torres to translate it. By then, my Orith was good enough. It said, the one who came back. I went inside. I sat on the floor, the way I had sat on the bridge floor on that first day when Mon had said human, and I had said yes. The ship hummed around me. Not the faint, tentative hum of a reactor at 3%, but the full, steady hum of something alive and purposeful, and full of other lives. Somewhere in the habitation rings, children were running in a corridor. I could feel the vibration of it faintly through the floor. Small feet on Orith metal, 40,000 years old and still strong. Mon said, through the room's speakers, "Are you comfortable in here?" I said, "Yes." "Did you build this for me?" Mon said, "The Orith had no word for stubborn. Their word for it meant the one who returns despite everything. They considered it the most important quality a conscious being could have. I thought you should have a room that knew that about you." I looked at the inscription on the wall. I looked at the amber light. I thought about a survey pilot who should have filed coordinates and gone home. I thought about a protein bar eaten in a shuttle at the edge of mapped space. I thought about the airlock cycling shut behind me, and the prime sequence played in the dark, and the choice to knock back. I thought about 4 years on a dead planet, about Owen crying not crying when he first saw the drive specifications, about Devi standing still outside the canyon, About Rook sitting down heavily when he saw the reactor. About Torres and Mon, talking for 6 months in a language no living person had spoken in 40,000 years. About 3 hours in a region of dead space where something vast and old and uncountable had looked at one human ship and decided, for now, not to cross the line. About a commons full of voices in languages I could not count. About a school on a ship. About coffee in the atmospheric sensors. About what it meant to find a broken thing and decide it was worth fixing. I sat in that room for a long time. Outside the viewport at the end of the corridor, visible if I angled right, the stars were out. All of them. Bright and steady and burning, the way stars burn when the dark has been pushed back far enough to let them do it. I thought, this is what the Orith left the door open for. Not for a hero, not for a fleet, for whoever was curious enough to walk through it, and stubborn enough to stay. I thought, one human, one broken ship, one canyon on a dead planet. I thought, it was enough. I stayed in that room until the amber light felt like home, and then I went back to work. There was always more work. There always will be. And I will always come back. End.